Welcome, everyone, to the Data on the Rocks podcast, which is Solidify's quest to share stories behind the people involved in the data industry. The rocks part of Data on the Rocks refers to the idea of having a conversation outside of the normal business context, of enjoying conversation with data professionals for the sake of it, for getting to know people who are passionate about data, willing to share their stories, and perhaps even nerd out a little bit on the world of data. Today, we're thrilled to have our guest, Beth Jacaruso from Moody's Analytics. Beth is the head of content strategy for data solutions. Beth, welcome. We're thrilled to have you.
Well, thanks, Drew. I'm happy to be here. I'm really excited for my data on the rocks.
I
I've
we're
got my
gonna
rocks.
we're gonna talk about the on the rocks part actually because it's quite important. But first, full disclosure for on behalf of both you and I that we've known each other for about a year now. And
Yep.
during that time, it's given us, and by the way, my condolences for from your side for knowing me for a year. But it's given me a chance to know obviously about your role, your professional role, and your perspective, and also watch how you develop relationships with internal colleagues and external parties. And this is just absolutely shameless on my part, but I've come to know you as a true professional by any measure. So we're especially pleased to have you join our show for those reasons.
You're too kind, but thank you.
Pleasure. So before we dive in, back to the rocks part of the conversation, before we dive in, I want to
Yes.
make note for everybody that we're recording this in the mid-afternoon time slot. And being the very responsible people that you and I are, we are enjoying, I think, a nice seltzer, a nice sparkling water. And I'm wondering what's in your glass today. What's your preferred flavor this
Yes.
afternoon?
So I have a cranberry lime with a little bit of ice. That's my on the rocks.
And is that the go-to every day?
That is a refreshing, yes, mid-afternoon, little bubbly, so I can pretend like it's that other bubbly.
Yeah.
But yeah,
So
good
I like
stuff.
the flavor combination. I'm having pomegranate blueberry actually, which is
Oh, that's very exotic.
it sounds so. I wouldn't imagine drinking it any other time, but the wonderful people who made this seem to do a good job of combining the flavors. So I'm pretty happy with that.
That's
Um,
great.
if we were to take it out of context from this discussion, if you were just thinking about another time and place away from your role, away from your job, and maybe you're with friends or family, what you mentioned other bubbly, would that be something you would enjoy? Would something like a champagne normally, would that be a drink you would
It would oh, yes, most definitely. A little Moet is always good for the soul, as is a nice Italian Prosecco.
nice?
Um, yeah, anything in those categories would be most welcoming.
I've been having uh, different at different times, different celebrations, observing how the tradition of saluting each other, of having a cheers when we're enjoying a nice beverage, and I always have this thing of watching how whether people look into each other's eyes, that connection when we cheers, when we clink
Yes,
glasses,
yeah,
right? Is there do you follow a similar rule about you've really got to look at the person and kind of study them when they do that?
yeah. I was told a long time ago that it doesn't count if you don't look into the person's eyes. So if you don't do that, then it doesn't count. So you have to keep making sure you make that eye contact.
Perfect. I love it. And that's a lot of work in a group setting, but I'm glad to hear we play by the same rules. That's excellent.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, for sure.
We want to take time to talk about you today, about learning about you and sharing your story. And we think about your role today in Moody's and how you got to where you are today. And we want to go back to the beginning, not the very beginning, but the beginning maybe of your data journey. And I'm thinking in
Sure.
particular about the starting your time in college, and you took an undergraduate degree in history, and I'm wondering if just, why that was the right starting point for you at that time in your life. What did history mean to you at the time?
Well, I loved learning about different peoples, different cultures, different places, as well as my own place where I live in the United States of America, and its rich history. And so I gravitated towards that major because of the storytelling, because of it understanding from where we were to where we are today. And so I focused, interestingly enough, on European medieval and Renaissance history,
Love it.
which is really going way back. But the thing that's remarkable and interesting about that time period is a lot of what I understood then and some of the challenges we're still facing and dealing with some of those same challenges. We're humans
Right.
with a lot of different types of wants, needs, and desires that really haven't changed over time. But what has changed is the technology that's been layered over it, and all the advances that have happened through history that
Right.
we've understood.
Right. When you mentioned stories right away, that the stories are, we think of history. Usually we think of history as being kind of a version of the truth, if not the truth. And we think of stories can be truthful, or they can be, of course, nonfiction as well, or fictional, pardon me, as well. Was it important learning about facts and trying to, was it a way for you to understand the truth as well, or was it understanding different perspectives of the truth? How did you kind of look at it, and from that perspective?
That's a great question. And I remember very early on in my tenure, I had a history professor who, as you can imagine, there was a lot of writing involved and a lot of papers that had to be written. And he really emphasized to us, the class, about how very important was when we were reading the books that were assigned to us, as well as when we were writing, that don't skip the preface.
Mm,
The preface is important because that is going to inform you about the story that you're about to embark upon. And that's what sets the stage to set up the structure and the framework. And that, I got to tell you, has carried with me to this day because it's all about how you organize that knowledge and the facts and
mm.
get the chronology correct to understand how one thing begat another. And so it's just been a natural evolution for me from that sort of very first early autumn September in New Hampshire of hearing that I've taken with me to this day.
And there's a discipline that goes along with it. What you're describing is not just a learning point, but now, it sounds like it's become a discipline of yours to look at context, to look at bias, which could be positive or negative. As you think about your current role, it sounds to me like you're incorporating that part of your background, your learning, into your current work.
Oh, for oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a construct and fundamentals that build sort of what is the content strategy for Moody's Analytics? What is it that we are trying to understand that our clients need? And it's a fact-based business. We're building products that are based on facts. And those facts have certain signals that help organizations determine which direction they should take their businesses. So it's the same principles, it's
Right.
just a different set of data that I'm looking at.
Right. It's a great framework. And speaking of frameworks, when after completing your history undergrad, you moved on to take on a graduate degree in library and information science. And was that an evolution, a path that you foresaw before early in your history undergrad, or was it a change in direction for you? How did you make that bridge?
Yeah, another interesting sort of evolution question for me and evolution of my career because right out of college, I then started to work at Arthur D. Little, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit. And the job that I landed there was in their corporate management library. And so it was my exposure to that in the real world that said, hey, maybe I should go think about and more formally educate myself on the theory that is surrounding what this library is and what it contains. And it's all about control and access of those facts and
Hmm.
understanding how to procure them and how they fit to meet the business cases that I was working on to support the work we were doing for our clients there. So that became a journey that formalized my thoughts and my theoretical understanding of the discipline and how I could apply that to the business world.
Did you also, so there was a lot that you were taking out of it, and it was satisfying an intellectual need by the sounds of it, what you're describing, kind of this intellectual need. Were you thinking a specific career path at that point when you were doing your graduate degree? Were you envisioning a career
I
path?
yeah, yeah, actually, because what I realized is like, wow, you get paid for this? To go on to a data safari, a research safari to get the underlying details that support a premise that you're trying to promote to a client. This is kind of cool. And wow, and it's in all these different categories. It's classical
Right.
management consulting, it's technology and product development, it's environmental health and safety. There's all these three facets, and so it began this opening my eyes wider to this whole world of business and the application of data there to support the projects.
So you've gone at this point in your journey, you've gone from the storytelling of history to really the formalities and the discipline of research and how to apply that to a particular topic or discipline. There's a build that I sense here that's happening in your career at this point in time.
Yes, because if you think about the traditional sort of library bibliography of these are
Right.
the facts that support, it was now taking that and transitioning that into the and evolving that. That word evolve keeps coming up, evolving that into the application in the business world of you need a bibliography to demonstrate this is the state of the industry, whatever industry you're researching for the projects associated with the clients, automotive, metals and mining, chemicals,
Right.
logistics, supply chain management, whatever the case may be.
Love it. At this point, you've completed your graduate degree. You're out seeking job opportunities. You land with Arthur D. Little, and in your first role, you spent a number of years there. And my perspective is that that's quite unusual that someone is able to find a role in an organization that they have a chance to grow with for a fairly long period of time. I think for yourself, correct me if I'm wrong, it was how many years with Arthur D. Little? It was about 10 years.
Like yeah, 10 or a little bit more than that,
Okay.
like 15 maybe.
Okay.
And it was really kind of like when people say join the Navy, see the world. It was join Arthur D. Little, see the world. And I really struck it uh, the luck there because it was a learning organization. They nurtured my desire for knowledge as well as at the same time supporting the work that needed to be done there and really climbing through the ranks and helping to develop some of the first knowledge management systems that helped to take those disparate sources of data that at that time were mostly in hard copy, right?
Wow. Right.
And transitioning them into the digital world. And the other fascinating thing is many of those sources, those reference sources that I used then, they are still viable today. The difference is they are now accessible by more people because of the medium from which you can now access them.
Right.
And so a lot of those sources on manufacturing, corporate affiliations, uh, import export data that governments have, all of that was available then, but it was very hard to bring it together because of the medium. And now technology has come in and just really exploded the access and the ways and the dimensions with which you can look at that data and see how it can give you different signals that you may not have been able to ascertain in its original formats.
When you think we're going to talk more about the continued evolution and the continued changes in data access, data practices, the liberation of data, transformation of data later on in the discussion. But given that you were at Arthur D. Little for say more than 10 years just to start your career. Was there anything significant? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, in my career, and I think you and I are roughly of the same era. Um, I'm recalling the mid 90s, how personal computers were really becoming prominent at that time, early 90s, but definitely mid 90s. When Windows 95 sticks out in my mind in 1995, for example.
Yeah.
Did that evolution in technology also affect your role at Arthur D. Little and the kinds of insights that your organization was creating as well?
100%. And that's part and parcel of what I was referring to a little bit ago about knowledge management systems. And
Right,
since management, Arthur D. Little, for those who are not aware, was an international management consulting firm. That's a fact-based business, right? You
right.
need facts in order to deliver on the the client's projects that are assigned. And so there's a lot of learnings to be taken from each of those projects that then can be taken to the next. And so I was involved in a process that kind of opened up people's heads and codified them into systems in that burgeoning Windows 95 database, creating databases and being able to create taxonomies against that detail that then could be reused and repurposed. And so again, there's another evolution there, right? Of taking that information and being able to repurpose it and reapply it to other instances.
We're hearing examples as you talk about where a certain practice that happened in the past, a certain way of organizing, is still potentially fundamentally sound today. It's the technology that's enabled either the speed or the distribution of the insights. It's allowed us to transform it, but the discipline of understanding information, and the strategies around how to distribute it, um, maybe haven't changed that much. At least that's an impression I'm getting from some of the thoughts you're sharing with us.
So I think in the previous world, it was very single-threaded that you may
Right,
have one source that you consulted and another source. Now we can take those sources today and we can bring them together and we can see what the union of those sources brings us in terms of insights and signals for the business world, whatever industry it is that you may be playing in. So our ability to get to an answer has accelerated
right.
because of the capabilities that technology has enabled us to do. And as my career has gone and evolved, so has that technology and what capabilities are there that allow us to commingle disparate sources of data to provide a different outcome, to create more data, right? And
Right.
yeah, to create more data.
Since we have a drinks theme to this podcast, there's probably a correlation here with food as well, and so far as creating recipes. And what you're describing is akin to creating a recipe of data, which is unique from the ingredients that we might use in making up that recipe. And so the idea of what you're just starting to describe, and we're going to, as as you moved on in your career, you moved to organizations like OneSource and Hart Hanks, which are very much focused on translating uh, raw ingredients. We might think of it as unstructured data or structured data, but those raw ingredients and transforming them into data solutions. And I'm different from Arthur D.
Right.
Little, right? Arthur D. Little would have been about translating into insights and I assume recommendations and strategy, if I understand correctly. But now at OneSource and Hart Hanks, you've moved on into the world of pure data, I guess, at this point in your career. And just
Yes.
wondering if
Yes.
you could share a little bit more about comparing and contrasting what you were um, learning and seeing with data as compared to what was happening at
Sure.
Arthur D. Little.
Sure. So at Arthur D. Little, I was a customer of tools that enabled me to conduct secondary research. At the other organizations that you've mentioned, at OneSource at Hard Hanks, I was now on the other end where I was helping to create those tools, to create those, whether they be B2B or B2C solutions that help clients. So I'm still delivering a product to an end client, but in this case, I'm actually developing the tool, and it was an understanding of how to develop that tool and what best met the customer's needs, and
Right.
understanding that voice of the customer. For every customer has some similarities, and then there's some other kind of bespoke products that we may deliver. But in my tenure at that point of my career, there was I flipped to the other side of the fence, if you
Right.
will. I'm now creating and delivering those tools to the management consulting professional services organizations of the world. They now became my customers.
Right. And
So the paradigm flipped.
yeah, and well, that's right. It's a different take on how to gain insight from data. It's a different, certainly different way to monetize the data, I suppose. That would be different than Arthur D. Little. Um, that brings us chronologically up into, I guess, the late 2000s, roughly, or mid
Hmm.
2000s. I'm trying to pick a
Sure.
time frame here.
Yeah.
it wasn't yesterday, but anyway, that's not my point. You moved on at that point, so this idea of how to curate data and present it back to an end user. Um, you move into a role at Venture Development Center, which strikes me as
Right.
being really interesting because uh, I'm not. Did Venture own its own proprietary data? Did it collect and harvest its own data, or was it more a builder of data solutions? I'm trying to compare and contrast here to your previous experiences.
Yeah, so it was more a creator of data solutions, and the really neat thing about Venture Development Center and my previous world is, so I shared that I worked on sort of the the primary source using tools and understanding different types of data sets that would allow me to answer the questions for my clients in the various industries globally.
Right,
And then I moved to the world where I'm now, hey, I understand all those data sets. I know what we can put into this tool to make it work. With that background, I now enter in the timeline of technology where there's been now an explosion of data because of that technology. And I think I shared with you the statistic recently. They say, what is it, 2.5 quintillion bytes of data are created every day, and that's equivalent to 10 million Blu-ray discs stacked up twice to meet the Eiffel Tower.
how about
That's how
that?
much data is being created. And so at VDC, because I had that knowledge and skill set about taking disparate sources, about using knowing what those different things were, now you've got to decipher through this explosion, and you need to understand, well, how do I categorize this? What kind of data am I looking at? Is this structured data? Is this unstructured data?
Right, right,
Is this compliant data? Am I allowed to use it?
right,
What are the boundaries here? What are the regulations that govern this? Because now government is involved here. And so that part of my career really opened my eyes to, wow, there's a big world out there, and it can be overwhelming. And so it's a matter of trying to, don't boil the ocean of data, but figure out the places where you can find the signal and where you can apply the goodness and the good bits
right,
to solve whatever your business problem is.
right. And so did VDC put together an end solution in response to a customer need or promote certain end solutions, or was it more about here's all the raw ingredients you need, come take what you need? What was the business model or the product focus
Yeah.
for them?
Right. So we had relationships with hundreds of partners,
Right,
data partners, people who were developing, who had created various different kinds of data sets. And we had both, I'll call them end users, like the professional services firms of the world. And we also had compilers of data that were interested in acquiring more data to create different kinds of offerings for their product set. And so we worked sort of both ends of the spectrum of consumers of data. And we further worked in both the B2B as well as the B2C world to understand those, because they're two very different animals in terms of data, and how those data sets are governed
Right.
depending upon the GDPR, CCPA when you're looking at consumer data, data privacy regulations when you're looking at B2B data in certain countries where they have put in certain limitations and restrictions on the use of that data.
Right. So suddenly, in the past, at one source, Hard Hanks, you had a relatively quite a defined universe of solutions to sell, to promote, and whatnot. There's obviously evolution that takes place during in any company's offering, right? There's a roadmap or what have you. At VDC, it seems to be almost the other way around, where the ingredients were the focus, and then you were able to help clients in a multitude of ways based on the vast variety of solutions that were available.
Yes, yes. So, and also that notion of commingling of data, that very
Right.
much was in play here, because it wasn't only about the data that we had under contract, so to speak, with our clients, but it was also about the evaluation of the data that those clients had, of how we could take their internal data and combine it with some external data sets to actually create an additional revenue stream for them. And so there was a lot of analysis that we
That's
undertook
interesting. Yeah.
in looking at the client's data itself, because every company creates data. Remember my 10 million Eiffel
Quintillion.
Towers of Blu-ray disc. Yes, yeah, my 10 million Blu-ray disc against the Eiffel Tower. So every company out there creates data. Right now, you and I are creating data as we're doing this podcast.
Right.
This is another piece of data that is out in the ether for people to consider. And so we were looking at their data to understand if there were applications of how we might be able to take that to create, like I said, additional revenue streams, but needing to go through various rigorous checks to understand, how is this compliant? Do we have use for this? Do we see this being collected in the foreseeable future, or is this kind of just a one and done type of data set that won't have a longevity to it? So those kinds of questions were asked to interrogate, to understand if it was viable to be able to commercialize and monetize, to use your term from earlier in our conversation.
Yeah, and that's not unlike the work that I was doing prior to Solidify. I was at a smaller firm called Think Data Works, whose focus originally was on open data, and in its timeline of development as a startup coincided with the explosion of open data. It would be interesting to sort of parallel their strategies and thoughts
Yeah,
towards open data from VDCs, because I think you touched on it briefly, but your time there would have coincided as well with the explosion in open data assets being published by governments. And today,
for sure.
right, we think of the proficiency. It's not always on the level that we want it to be at as business users, but we think about the proficiency of government to publish data assets. We think about counties in the U.S. We think about cities, states, federal government agencies. These have all contributed to, as you described, this explosion of data. I didn't have it on our something you just said a moment ago reminded me of this question. And this question, it wasn't on our script for today, but it is related to the evolution of data, and that's this idea that has always been put forward that data is the new oil. Um, and what I love is the fact that it's prompted a lot of debate about whether that analogy is even true or not. And it seems to be, the more I've read about it, the more resistance there is to making that analogy. Because it's something that you just mentioned, is that data is regenerative, that data not only can be reused over and over again, but it actually can spawn other data.
Hmm.
which would I don't know if you would agree with this, but it would refute the argument that data is the new oil, where oil is a limited resource, right? Is an exhaustible resource. Have you debated that argument
So,
before? Is it an analogy? I don't know. Do you like the analogy? Do you disagree with the analogy? Where would you fall in that spectrum?
well, when people talk about oil, and they're certainly talking about it lately in the news, but that's for another podcast
Yeah,
and another time. It's a commodity, right?
right,
And some people can view commodity, and when you say that in product development, oh, that's a commodity. We're not going to earn a lot of revenue on that. It's that whole seeking alpha, right? Of how you can take a data set, like I'm saying, and be able to create the new oil, to create what makes that, and the process by which that goes through the refinery.
right.
That's the same thing that we're doing with the data, is we're seeking the alpha out of that data
Absolutely.
to identify the signals in that. And the the art of the possible, as I like to say, is that we're able to identify where those signals are, which kind of brings me to today, not to advance but kind of brings me to where I am at Moody's Analytics, and that's what we're doing.
Right.
That's I you know
Yeah, and which is that is a great segue for us, because we want to now look at your current role, your current environment. Um, uh, you now sit after certainly 20 something, early 30 something years of experience working in data related fields. You now come to a global organization, got a tremendous legacy and positive reputation, of course. Um, you're looking at this from the perspective of being an experienced professional. Um, uh, and when you think about the realities, as we've just started to touch upon, the realities of the data world today, variety, complexity, volume, how do, when you think of the job at hand that you have to do and the clients that you're serving, how do data professionals deal with these dynamics? What stands out for you, and what's the kind of the perspective you have in your role about dealing with the complexity of today's data?
Well, before I answer that, just a moment to step back in the context of where I am right now at Moody's and
Right.
Moody's Analytics. And we've been talking about evolution throughout this conversation. And think about this: Moody's was established back in 1898, and it's still here today.
Wow.
And it has a prominent place, in my opinion, in sort of the American business history, similar to Arthur D. Little. It's kind of two bookends of my career here.
Yes.
Of that too was a company started in the late 19th century in 1886. So Moody's, as a company established back then, has evolved to it's still in business today. And the whole thing that differentiates Moody's is that we we have data with predictive value. We understand how to look at that data and apply it. And so it was a natural fit, and I'm thrilled to be part of the organization where I can take what I've learned in my experiences and apply it quite naturally to what we're trying to do at Moody's with business data, and evolving it and finding those signals and delighting our customers.
And
So it's just a natural progression personally for me, but very excited to be part of that on such a global level in so many countries.
this has all happened in the last year. I think you joined midway through 2021, if I recall. So
That's
we're
correct.
coming up
Yep.
to about a 1 year anniversary, give or take, um, in
Right.
your journey. And now I slipped in the word legacy when I mentioned Moody's in my preamble, and I'll qualify that certainly. Um, and I'm glad you mentioned the dates, the founding dates for the organization. It really speaks to a company that's been able to evolve, back to your word, and innovate. and grow. I mean, it's been successful on virtually every measure you could think. Its relevance today's business world. I know the organization's gone through tremendous reorganization as well as it's
Mhm.
redefined its value between the traditional analytics side and other parts of the business. Um, which brings us to kind of the focus that you have in your role and the realities of how you look at data today, the dynamics around variety, complexity, volume. Um, when you think about the landscape of data, what are the things that come to mind that are important for our listeners to think about?
So there are so many what is known in the industry as alternative data sets that are
Yes,
out there that are not traditionally thought of that can have application in the business world and to some of the products that we're building at Moody's Analytics. So the things that come to mind for me are geolocation data, satellite imagery, customs data. And certainly in the world of supply chain management and the challenges that we read in that area of the disruptions in that we read in the newspapers every day in the world that we're living in and the current events that we're trying to work through. And Moody's is one of those companies that's coming to the table with our clients and prospects to say we have solutions for this. We have taken these disparate sources of data and we have figured out how, if you bring them together, it can create these different insights that help identify that there's going to be um, a risk here in your supply chain that you're going to have to pivot from whatever your tier one or tier two suppliers were to think of an alternative and for us to help to identify that. Again, back to the predictiveness of the data, being able to send that early warning signal to
right.
our customers as to how to pivot and to avoid a delay, to avoid a stoppage in the production of your goods and services. And so I'm delighted to be part of a place where I'm able to contribute through my content strategy work to understand how and what those data sets should be and how to prioritize those data sets and how to create that framework that allows us to understand the use cases that are important to us against the data types that are available, against the the revenue opportunities. Obviously, we
Sure,
can't forget
sure.
that where the revenue opportunities are, and it really comes down to just also, I cannot forget, is the voice of the customer. That needs to be, that qualitative piece needs to be woven into the equation in order to understand how do we bring all this together from a content strategy perspective to say this is what we're going to go after that supports our growth initiatives as an organization to get us to the next level, and most certainly to help our clients and bring them to the next level along with us.
A lot of times when we think, I love the fact that you've touched on voice of the customer, and I'm thinking of some of the experiences that, well, we all have experiences every day using software, for example, and we use data, whether we're in the data business or not, we use data every day in our personal and professional lives. But I'm thinking about comparing and contrasting experiences that you've had in the past in other organizations to the work that you're doing now at Moody's. When you think of what does voice of the customer mean, it's a buzzword in a sense, right? It's meant to conjure up how we increase our commitment to customers, how we understand their needs, how we represent, their rational and possibly even emotional needs as clients. Um, do you think, if you compare and contrast how software companies might go about voice of customer compared to how data companies need to be proficient at voice of customer. And if I were to say to you, and this is just an opinion, of course, but let me throw it out there, why not? I think it's harder to get good at that as a data company than as a software company. That really pinning down what your customer is looking for. I don't know if that resonates with you or not, if you agree or not. and if it has any relevance in the Moody's context. But what are your thoughts there, just about getting good at voice of customer? What does that mean?
Sure. Yeah, I actually have a lot of thoughts on that. So first of all, when I think about a software company, I think about features and functions.
Right.
And I think that that's why in your comments, in your opinion, that that feels easier to you. That
It's
feels easy. That's something tangible,
tangible.
right?
Right.
That's something
Right.
features, functions. I don't like that the button is in the upper right. It should be in the lower left, etc. Aha. But in data, let's go back to what we just talked about and how I was sharing with you sort of my academic formal education and about the organization of knowledge and about the control and access of that. It is those discipline, it's that discipline that I apply upon the voice of the customer, because what's hard is the voice of the customer is a stream of consciousness
Right.
that sales and marketing, product, we all have conversations. But the challenge, and again, that creates that art of the possible, is taking that voice of the customer and be able to say, okay, this is related to supply chain. All right, here they're talking about a compliance. That's really a compliance comment, and starting to stack all of those comments up that tells a story that says, you know what? This is about ownership data. This is about executive contacts. This
Yes.
is, and being able to make the connection. And then before you know it, I now have a stack of all of these comments, all of these streams of consciousness that are associated with a various, whether it be a data type, whether it be a particular use case,
Yes.
that I can then translate to requirements that then allow us to say, hey, if we enhance this, then it's going to make us that much better. If we increase our coverage in a certain region of the world, this is going to delight our customers because we're missing this whole pocket. This is what I'm hearing. So the challenge, the art,
Mm-hmm.
is to be able to take the voice of the customer and be able to taxonomize it and to be able to organize it in a way that then can be translated into those features and functions.
Love it. You're talking about a really important methodology, and in your role, it's something, we haven't talked about this in the past. What would be kind of your connection? I'm just thinking on a practical level, time and effort. Yeah, I'm not sure how Moody's executes or conducts voice of customer. I'm sure there's many different avenues, but is it something you're directly involved in? Is that something you invest time in yourself directly in your role?
That, yes, that is, I would say, the heart and soul of what I need to be mindful of. And much as I shared about earlier in my career, I am fortunate that at Moody's, I am working at a company that is a learning organization that also fosters innovation
I love it.
and allows one to sort of create that business to and be creative about it. And that's the joy that that brings to me, to be able to take that and create, from something, from nothing, something that we're then able to translate into products.
Well, you began your career in uh, learning about stories told through history. You're at a point in your career, well, where you continue to learn, you continue to demonstrate a commitment to what customers need, their changing requirements, and all throughout it, learning has been a factor for you in your career, that has been at the heart of what you shared with us today. Um, which brings us to where we started, really, which is about data stories and the notion of how we take facts and we shape a view. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the idea of taking data per se and stories, that construct of weaving things together. What does that mean to you? Like, I know you advocate for it, but I'm just trying to imagine how that applies in your role and what it means to you personally.
So recently I had a conversation with a colleague about, bringing a team together to work on a particular project. And we've all been on different teams and everybody brings a different skill to the reason why you pick them to create that team. And I say, you got to meet the people where they're at. And
Right.
at Moody's, working globally and with all the different cultures that have different stories and diversification around them. You got to meet the people where they're at in order for us to contribute to deliver on that product. And so you got to harness that. And so it's hearing those stories and getting that perspective and meeting people where they're at in order to help us deliver what we need to deliver to our clients, and looking at the left of the data, the right of the data, on top of the data, and not to mention also understanding how we source that data.
Right.
Is it something that we do ourselves, or is it something that we license? And understanding what are the dynamics that are related to that, and really delving into that to understand what is the best approach for us to get to market
Yes.
and to be successful.
And on just building on that theme of success and looking ahead, um, uh, no doubt the Moody's experience has been a fantastic one for you at this stage in your career. Um, what would you say is, on top of all of the positives you've spoken about, what would be the thing that excites you most about the direction that Moody's is going in today?
I think it's the discovery of what's yet to be known. Going back to the 10 million Blu-ray disc that equate to two Eiffel Towers, we've only, scratched the surface to understand what's the next big emerging market or use case that's going to help delight our customers. And I could be right here on my desk on in my laptop, and I don't even realize it yet. And it's that discovery process and the ability to explore and to understand how that can be applicable and repurposed multiple times over.
Uh,
That's the magic.
Beth, I don't know if you if Moody's uses Slack. We use Slack as a communication channel, and it's one of those things where quite often you create a very informal profile name for yourself, not a nickname per se, but a profile. It's usually not your job title. You'll be proud to know that mine says Discoverer on it,
I
to
love it.
exemplify what I do. So I just wanted to share that with you as we come to kind of the end of our discussion today. And I think this has been a great learning experience for me. And we want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story, from historian to library scientist to long-standing and successful data professional. Thank you very much for joining us and being a part of these early days of the Solidify Data on the Rocks podcast. It's really been a pleasure having you.
Happy to be a part of it, Drew. Thanks so much. I really appreciate